everybody, to another episode of the SaaS Stories Podcast. Today, I'm super excited because we're going to be talking all things ESG. I'm joined by Andrew Gazal from ESG Tech, all the way from Singapore. Welcome, Andrew.
Hi, Joanna. Pleasure to be here today, and thank you for the invitation.
Absolutely. Really excited to have you on the show. Now, first question, of course, is what is ESG Tech? Tell us what inspired you to start it.
Yeah, no problem. So from a technology standpoint, ESG Tech is a data management platform. So we simply help customers organize their data and democratize data capture. So I'll give you a basic example. Most businesses have a time where they go off Excel onto Xero for their financial accounting because it gets too complicated, or there's too much governance, or there's just too much risk of having an incorrect number. That same process is happening now in the space of ESG data capture, and a lot of ESG data is predominantly operational data that you find inside a business. And yes, there are many operational platforms, SAP, Oracle, but they're at a price point that very much is limited to the large caps. However, we're seeing a lot of businesses that are, say, suppliers of a large cap company that are now receiving the pressure of their data requirements. And therefore are looking for solutions in market that are affordable and provide the features that they require.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's good to have an option that is affordable, because I think a lot of medium-sized companies as well, they also have net zero targets that they need to meet. So they need to measure this data. Is it fair to say that they're all doing it manually at the moment through spreadsheets or something?
Very much so. Even the larger firms are still doing it then very manually, and also once a year. So they're aiming for it to be at the end of the year where they're collating data, which can extend the process upwards of 3 months once you go through a review process. What we try to do is similar with, a lot of businesses are used to the common definition of month end, where you're closing your books for the month. What we try and do is encourage that same process flow for other forms of data within your business, or at least in a quarterly. And what that does is two things: is spreads out the load, so it's not a big force at the end of the year, but also allows businesses to be more proactive. So you may start to see your data trend in a way that could compromise business or strategy or a net zero target, and then be able to take actions to reduce that risk, where when it's a look back after 12 months, you don't really have that chance. You're now just disclosing what you did, and then having to deal with the outcome of that with each of your stakeholders.
Yeah, much easier process. Do you find that this is becoming more and more important to organizations as they are, having to meet compliance and targets around ESG?
Yes, I think there's a lot of downwards pressure. Say, for instance, we're based in Singapore, and we're seeing a lot of our Asian clients or Asian-based clients not respond to domestic regulations, but their client regulations that are based in Europe. So you're now having 90% of your revenue is from exports, and that export function is now asking for not just information about your product, but information about your business. And if you choose to ignore that, you're basically jeopardizing your revenue stream. So it becomes important based on, it's very much more important when you correlate it back to chances of loss of revenue, or, as you pointed, potential risks within your business. And I think similar to how you mentioned SMEs looking for something that's price conscious, I think also not every SME or mid-cap have a chief risk officer. So you have these you have these requirements and responsibilities spread across an organization, which typically means then you need to at least have a common platform that is usable from across all of the organization. So at least everyone's talking and utilizing the same piece of information for them to deal with their own responsibilities.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think coming back to that revenue element, we've actually launched a few ESG related messages for some clients. And I actually find that if you don't tie, the need for ESG back to, the company's long-term financial performance and opportunities, then the audience is not really that interested. So what are maybe some ways that you could assign monetary value or, you know, profits for a company when it comes to ESG? Because I think a lot of companies are probably struggling to measure that at the moment.
Yeah, it's a great point, and I always look at it as someone who's from the energy sector originally before getting into software. If you can't have a conversation with the CFO, then you're never going to have anything move forward. So it needs to be broken down to dollars and cents at some point. We see a lot of movement in that idea of a roadmap, and consultants are pushing that. But a lot of businesses are now at that point where it's like, you need to quantify this roadmap. And the way that, we look at businesses, and our own business in particular, is what's the return on investment? And that investment can be in a sustainability aspect of a strategy, but that strategy still has to be the business's strategy. So the way in which we look at this is, if I'm capturing operational data, I need to be interrogating in a way that I can put it as a unit cost, so that I can see that for every $1 spent, this is the return, or this is the negative effect it may have. And then that way everyone's talking from the same piece of paper. And what I mean by that is it's a balance sheet discussion now. So if the quicker you can internally in your business try to quantify these strategies as a forward revenue stream or a potential mitigation against risk, the easier it is for everyone to come on board the journey. I think too much conversation has been at a high level that we want to be more sustainable, we want to be more green, but where the rubber hits the road, you need people who are capable within the business, that understand the business and say, okay, well, if I do option A or option B from a strategy perspective, regardless whether the word sustainable is used, there will be an outcome. And then if one of those outcomes have greater attributes relative to ESG or sustainability, then maybe tag that strategy as a more sustainable strategy. But fundamentals need to always take precedence within the strategy process.
Yeah. Sounds like you've got a good process there happening. When you do go into these meetings with say the ESG leaders or even the C-suite or the CFO, what do you find are common misconceptions that people have about ESG?
That they don't know anything about it. So I'll give you my own example. As I said, I'm from the energy sector originally, and you learn very quickly when you build and construct major assets, the idea of enterprise risk and risk assessment. And you know that in and out because you have to monitor that as part of your dealings. When you go into a business and you ask them some operational metrics, so let's look software, for instance, and say, how many data breaches have you had? How many personal data breaches have you had? These are fundamentally information that the CTO or at least the COO would have an answer to, but they wouldn't naturally think that that's an ESG metric. Where fundamentally, if you have a data breach, then you have a governance issue. If you have a governance issue, then a potential stakeholder may not choose to use you as a service supplier. So it's educating people that a lot of this information they know, but it's how they deliver it to different stakeholders and how to stay within the bounds of what's considered, and I say this, without going into the world of greenwashing. And that, yes, it's called greenwashing, but it can be across ES and G. It's basically you're throwing out something that's just completely impossible to achieve, and you're saying that without the care that someone else can probably do a backhand calculation and call you out on it, which we're now seeing in a lot of industries.
Yeah, it's a good point, actually. I mean, when you mentioned that, I was like, what does cybersecurity have to do with ESG? But now that you explained it, see, I think there's definitely a lot of education that still needs to happen around ESG, even today in 2024. Can you discuss the impact of regulatory changes on ESG reporting and compliance for organizations?
Yeah. So that example I gave you from a revenue stream perspective, but from an operational standpoint, it's just going to be another layer of governance that all businesses are going to see. At some point, that requirement is going to also that deliverable, I should say, is going to require audit and assurance. And we're starting to see that with, say, GHG calculations. But very soon that's going to be the same as your financial data, with everything has to be audited and assured. At that point, it's physically impossible for the amount of audit and insurers in the world to manage the amount of work in market. So technology will have to lift, almost 70% of the requirements, and then consultants and auditors will have to, be the ones utilizing that technology to streamline processes. So why I say that is it's going to impact businesses when you're not prepared for it. And we've started to see, unfortunately, some of the regulation be kicked out in Europe and the US in terms of timelines and size of companies. I think Australia hasn't delayed anything, but still haven't implemented completely the regulation requirements or regulatory requirements. But soon it's going to be a default requirement. So you will have technology implemented in businesses, and they're no different to how you plan for your financial audit and assurance cycles.
Yeah. Can you share maybe an example or a success story with us on how ESG tech has made an impact?
Yeah, so right now in today's world, there's a lot of hype around AI, and we can touch on that. But really what we do as a data management platform is generate efficiencies for businesses in their process flow. So jobs to be done within a business, which would take maybe 2 hours, we do it within an hour as a base case example. So if you can create better time, if you can reduce the time, then you obviously have a direct relationship to costs, and that was that cost benefit I mentioned before. The other component is data governance. So not many people understand the importance of data governance, and this is going to become something that I think needs to be more mainstream, both in the conversation of sustainability, but just in general, how clean is your data? How accurate is your data? Because you're making decisions on that data. So an example, we have a customer who's an asset manager. They manage several properties. They saw the need to move away from Excel onto a more specific platform. The reason was more about, at a board level, they wanted confidence in the roll-up of the data values. So if I'm aggregating information, I need to know that the underlying values are correct. And by having a platform that deals with calculations, has audit trails, if they wanted to pry or probe, you're able to do that. Where with spreadsheets, as you know, with macros, it could get lost entirely. So that was the driving force, but then what they saw as an outcome was also efficiency gains within their business. So maybe a reduction in headcount or a reutilization of that headcount to do things that are less administrative and more strategy in relation, to their business.
Got it. Thank you, Andrew. I think I've asked you quite a bit of ESG questions just because selfishly I'm trying to learn more about it. But coming back to scaling SaaS questions, really just for the founders and the marketers that are listening today, can you give us some key challenges you faced just from scaling ESG tech, and how did you overcome them?
Yeah, definitely. Look, I'm not naturally from technology. I'm an engineer by trade, but as I said, from the energy sector. So I had to learn the IT and software business and understand the personnel that are in there and the roles and responsibilities. One thing which I noticed quickly is that just determining what scale of infrastructure you want to build from the get-go. So what I mean by that is you may have a hope of 10,000 customers in 5 months, and that will have a bearing on how much you need to charge or get charged by AWS or one of the big cloud providers, and it will then dictate what type of infrastructure you lay out, and they can be large capital costs. So understanding what your growth is and then pricing back to that point of return on investment, what it may cost to do a rebuild in 3 years' time rather than building for today for a tomorrow problem. So that was one thing which I always was on the cautious side, but naturally it would have a cost to the business in terms of having a larger infrastructure when you're starting with client number one. The other one is more of a product market fit, and I'm sure everyone's spoken about this a huge amount. I personally also, again, struggled with that creation of a persona and building something with a lot of customer feedback, particularly in our space where ESG was, I started this journey in 2018. So before the acronym was a buzz, the client didn't know what they wanted. So you were testing out theories and then taking back what you think is right. And that's that's quite a challenge within a business, particularly also with, as I said, personalities within software creation who are very much around, I want to go and do market feedback. I want to have surveys. I want to have this process, but that process takes money, takes time. And then, yes, it will help maybe reduce the risk of not hitting a product market fit. But in some cases, you may not know what the market needs, or also the market may not know exactly what they need at start. So balancing that, I think, is something that I found difficult as a founder, and also within a team, to try and agree on what we see as the best go forward strategy from a development stage.
Yeah, no, those are some good points you raise actually about challenges when it comes to SaaS. I think the first one, I've always wondered whether, having a technical background really helps if you're going to be a SaaS founder, or can you hire for that instead? Does it make things a lot more difficult? And I think to your second point as well, around your buyer persona, I always feel like when I talk to SaaS startups, they just think like, no, our product is designed for everybody. We've got this wide audience. And I'm always trying to encourage them to niche and find, the actual ideal client profile that they need to target. Have you managed to find that now? Do you find that certain industries and job titles are more inclined to accept ESG help?
Yeah, great question, because we had this challenge. So I was ambitious and went after the whole ESG. So our platform is industry agnostic, materiality agnostic, i.e. we cover everything, nearly every framework that's relevant in market. What that mean was you had platforms that were just focusing on carbon, and you had us saying, well, we can do everything, which then made it difficult for us to decide, do we need to get a concentration in one industry, although we can service all of them, build up that profile and then spread to parallel industries? Or do we look for industries that maybe need that widespread? I'll give you an example. A private equity firm may invest in electric car vehicle manufacturing, to solar farms, to software, where each of those have different material risks, and therefore a platform would have to be able to deal with different industries on one platform. We did the latter. However, in the early years, we didn't see the driving force from financial institutions. Yes, there was a huge amount of conversation and a huge amount of marketing, but other than public equities or large sovereign funds that were getting stakeholder pressure, there was no major regulatory push. So asking a private equity firm to ask more questions of their portcos was a bit of a no situation. I see the value in your platform, but I don't have the requirement today.
Yeah, it's a nice to have, not a need to have.
Exactly right. Yeah. One good fund manager said, yes, I manage 20 billion, but at any point I can pick up the phone and ask the CEO of that portco for the information that I need. So there was that relationship rather than looking at it as a data governance and a growth. And now we kind of over time start to obviously maintain relationships with the clients that said, or potential clients that said no, and seeing how their stories change. And one interesting one we saw was a private equity firm who doesn't have a investment thematic that incorporates ESG, but realized if they don't have historical data on their portcos when they go for their exit, then they may be at a disadvantage from a valuation perspective if they're going to sell to a KKR or to a larger firm. So they're mitigating against their pricing by just requesting additional data and storing it. So everyone has their reasons, different may be, but people are looking at ESG as a more open conversation and not to be a savior, but what does it mean for me in my business, rather than someone telling me I should be looking at this.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds like you've had quite a few learnings and pivots, which is very typical, I think, in the early days. From a marketing point of view and just acquiring new clients, what did you find worked the best?
Technical knowledge of the domain. So I was, again, lucky enough, and even our leadership team all came from different backgrounds, whether it be telco or banking. are able to sit in a room with someone who is from telco, oil and gas, or banking and relate and have a direct conversation and know where the hurdles are going to be on their side. This space is very hard, at least from SaaS from our side, is to build a sales force that just goes on and does the hard sell and has the playbook. We're still trying to convince people to show the value, and therefore if you can't speak in the same language as them from an industry perspective, it's very difficult then to make a sale, or worse, you're compared with a platform that you're far superior over, but they can't distinguish the difference between yours and a potential competitor or someone who claims to compete in market.
Right. Yeah, for sure. I think definitely having the same language would work best. What about like getting in front of them? Was that a challenge for you, just getting in the same room to actually be able to have that conversation? What did you find worked best for that?
The hustle, just pick up the phone, go to school, send out a polite email. Again, apologies for anyone who have the bot emails, but I don't read the 30 that I get every day, because I can instantly tell this is a 1% game that they're trying to capture. Having a way to understand the business, do a little bit of research, why not put a sentence in there that they can see you've done some research, and then spark the conversation is the only way. We're not a big team, so we try and do partnerships a lot. So that helps us in terms of growing our sales force indirectly. But when it, as you said, when it's sitting in a room with someone, it's first going old school and calling and trying to connect, and then presenting to them something that's relative to their business, not a sales pitch where the end question is, so do you want to buy what we have to offer?
Yeah. No, for sure. Those emails and even those LinkedIn messages frustrate the heck out of me. So I get it.
Yeah. I don't know how it works, but obviously someone's clicking on it.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's all about that one liner really that really just allows them to connect to the pain point that they're having. And if that resonates with them, really long emails, I find people just switch off immediately. So it's good to hear some traditional methods still work.
Yeah. It's hard to find people's phone numbers these days, bud, and calling reception with everyone working from home, and that doesn't exactly work like the original days. But there's where there's a will, there's a way.
Absolutely. And if they're anything like me that never answers my phone, you've got a challenge on your hand.
Yeah, you think it's a prank now, or someone trying to take money from your bank account.
Exactly. So. Pretty much 90% of it.
Yeah.
Coming back to the team that you mentioned, you've got a smallish team, but actually I love learning about who was your first hire and why, and would you do things differently knowing what you know now?
Good question. So I'll give you two first hires if I can. My very first hire was a gentleman I worked with in the energy sector, who was a double degree in mechanical and software, and I had trust in his capabilities, although I hadn't seen software development side. So he built me my first, let's call it very basic MVP, to, I would say, more demonstrate the process rather than look for revenue. That was a great hire because I went in with a level of trust that already existed. The more larger hire where that wasn't a partner, that wasn't coming in directly as a partner, was a woman who was introduced through a mutual friend who was from the banking sector, who was looking to explore different opportunities, wanting to derive away from banking and understand ESG and sustainability, but in that tech financial space. And what drew me to hiring her was just the willingness to give everything a go, to dive in, to not be so narrow in, I only do this and you're employing me to do this only. I think they're great hires. It can be difficult, I said, in software because people get very specific and don't like to maybe go wide. And we've tried a lot to focus on full stack developers because it gives you that breadth internally to solve problems or to deliver product. But that then also required strong conversations with people to, go a bit outside their comfort zone and widen their skill sets. And ultimately, I think they win in the long run because they have a wider skill set. Data scientists have been an interesting one because they tend to be very specific and like to be specific. And it reminds me of my science days where I have to have the hypothesis, the aim, the results, and then the conclusion before we take a next step forward. And that, again, can have its challenges when you're trying to start a company who's not backed by larger investors. We were bootstrapped very much for the beginnings to get going in this space.
Yeah. It's a fine line and it's like a balance that you need with the people that you work with. You kind of want people to be specialized in one field because they're just going to be absolute experts in it. But at the same time, when it's a startup, you kind of need people to do multiple jobs at the same time. So it's really hard finding that balance, isn't it?
Agree. Everyone has to wear multiple hats at the start. And it goes back to that infrastructure comment I made about scaling is, if you bring too many people in too early, you just have large overheads and they will ultimately challenge the business as well.
Yeah, absolutely. What other advice would you give to SaaS founders looking to scale, or even just, they're thinking about starting a business, maybe they have some reservations. What advice would you have for them?
Loaded question. I'll go down the personal route and say that if you have a partner, you need to sit down and have a very, very long heart-to-heart question. I underestimated the pressure it put on my partner. We didn't have children when we started. We were excited about the opportunity that one of us takes a leap and the other one supports the family. But the emotional roller coaster I think, felt more on the partner than me. I have a natural ability to just deal with stress, and I have a breaking point, which last year I reached. But going through that journey with my partner, you really need to think about that and need to be open with each other around it, because there's a huge sacrifice that they make on their side that you don't really think about in the equation.
Yeah, that's such good advice. Normally, when I ask that question, people give, business advice, but actually, this is such a good point because, the support that you need when you're running a business is absolutely crucial. The people that you surround yourself with on a daily basis, they can make and break the business at the end of the day. So having that support and being on that journey together really does play a pivotal role.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, once the business started to take shape, I had one of my cousins actually advising from the sidelines and then decided to come in completely. And although we had only had a family relationship up until then, you go in with a different level of trust. As I said, when I first asked a friend of mine to try some software, is you don't feel like they're just going to walk away, where a lot of partnerships, co-founders, founders, they just, it gets too tiresome for them, or they're not really in it. Those fundamentals about trust are hugely important. And it's difficult because I think if I go back in the corporate world, your level of trust for upper management and that, I think, has always changed over time. That word loyalty is kind of washed away a bit. And you try to create that in your own business, but you need to look at, well, how do I measure that? How do I know whether I've got the right indicator on it? And you'll get it wrong, but it's hugely important.
Yeah. I always say trust is your best currency. And it's not just about customers. You're right. It is about the people that you work with as well. I mean, the last thing you want is to spend all that time, energy, effort training someone for them to just walk away because they're not ready for it.
Completely. And being a non-technical founder, i.e. not from software, but I understood the domain, you're always wondering whether the software leadership is going to look for the next big thing, because we had our major development piece through the COVID period, and being based in Singapore, the price for resources was very, very high. So you're trying to balance out making this financial commitment and hoping that they don't leave after a while because one of the banks offered them 3 times the amount. And I think in that scenario, it's about building something that people relate to and feel like it's going to have a bigger impact than their own contribution. When we can, we hire as many interns. We had one period of time, I think there was 4 or 5 in the office, and they loved it because we throw them in the deep end, we commit to getting them involved, and some of them always write back to me saying, look, really appreciate how much you did, because as a company, not just me, but we speak to some of our friends who went to a big bank and they spent half the time asleep on a couch because no one gave them anything to do. So I was like, well, you definitely weren't asleep in your internship, but nothing would drive them more than them believing in what you're trying to do and understanding it. And when they do, then that's really the only thing you have to keep people on the journey.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of people aren't actually driven by money at the end of the day. And I think, the world of SaaS startups is so exciting because you get to learn so much. You're implementing things every single day, whereas in the world of corporate, you're right, you're sitting on the couch waiting 6 months for everyone to approve what you gave them 6 months ago.
Yeah. And then your internship's over.
Yeah. Coming back to ESG, it's obviously a very trending topic. I think content-wise, if people can get really lost and confused, how do you stay updated on the latest trends and developments in ESG? What are some sources that you trust when it comes to ESG?
Responsible Investor. I think it's unfortunately a paid service now, but I find their articles interesting, and usually because it's from industry personnel writing in. That would be the one where I go through for information. The other thing, which is a bit harder, but take an industry that you're from and then look for, as sad as it sounds, but look for court cases or cases that are coming up, whether it's from stakeholders or shareholders that are publicly listed, to narrow down the reasons why it exists and then try and correlate back to what could have been a mitigating action to change that, and then rolling that back into your business to say, do we have policy or procedure? And why I say that, which might sound a bit odd, is because if you're not looking at things that could impact your own business, then you're just generally reading information, and you're not upskilling in what ESG would mean specifically to your industry. So I try and look for ways where I can pinpoint something and then see what impact it could have in either a client's business or our business, as an example.
Yeah, good point. I think it's, speaking of upskilling as well, I mean, there's a lot of organizations that have multiple employees. What do you think about them offering training on ESG related courses, even just the basics, the fundamentals of ESG, all the way to really specific topics around, climate change, governance? How important do you think that is for big organizations to implement?
Look, I think there's a baseline level of knowledge, so call it Sustainability 101 or ESG 101, and we've got a great partner, Global Green Connect, in this region that helps roll out those upskilling programs to larger organizations. When people ask me what program should I do, should I go to the Cambridge sustainability course or should I do my gap risk? And my view is, if you're coming at this completely blank, only do one Sustainable 101 program. Don't do more than one, because you'll learn enough acronyms in just that one. And then 2, try and find within your organization something that you can do. And it may not be specifically your responsibility, but take ownership of it. So let's say you're in procurement and you say, I want to reassess our procurement strategy to look at green procurement, and then highlight some of the criterias, then look at how do we implement this across our current suppliers, and then not say that it cancels suppliers or not, but just look at the information and say, would this change our business? If you don't apply it practically straight away, then it's useless to you. And if you can't find a way to apply it, then have general knowledge and understanding, and then know who you need to speak to when there's a requirement for you or your organization to deal with.
Yeah, just like any training, really. If you don't use it, you just lose it. I mean, you literally forget 90% of what you just watched unless you go and then apply it. So that's a good point.
Yeah.
Mm.
And a deliverable is key. I mean, I do some guest lecturing and take some training programs here in Singapore, and the feedback I always got from attendees was, we do this course, not the one I was teaching, but we do a course, and all we have is a bunch of decks and some references to websites. Where the courses I take, I actually provide our more basic platform free to the attendees, because it allows them to start their journey of creating a disclosure in line with one of the frameworks that are internationally recognized. So they may be putting in bits and bobs of data and not a complete report, but they've started that journey, so they can take that back to their office. They can they can finish the rest, and then they can go to their management and say, here's what I think our baseline disclosure looks like. Do we want to put more effort into it? But if you go back to the office and say, I've done ESG 101, then usually a manager's going to go, okay, so how do we rank? And you're a middle SME with no benchmarking. So your response is going to be, yeah, we're good, because you're safeguarding your job in that instance.
Yeah, good point. My very last question for you, Andrew, it always ends on a positive note. It's really from a professional as well as a personal point of view, what do you look forward to in the future? Do you have hopes for ESG and just for the environment?
My hope is sustainability reports will come to an end soon, and the key material data would just be found in financial disclosures, because that's where things really start to reflect the changes in businesses, because you're pricing in risk, you're pricing in opportunities. No doubt we will get there. Just naturally, yeah, naturally, regulation, particularly in the financial sector, will get there, and we're seeing scenario analysis being treated more rigorously in Europe, and that's having a downstream effect to how banks lend to clients. I would also say that don't think ESG is the savior of the world. It's just an acronym. It just helps you define materiality within a business and define it down to a point where you can hopefully capture a piece of data, quantitative or qualitative. You still need to have a business strategy that aligns with a commercial strategy that endures that the business is sustainable. And what I mean by sustainability in that context is not whether it's green or whether it's brown, but whether it's going to exist in 5 years' time from now without having a negative effect on society or the environment. And there will be businesses that will always have that trade-off. We saw the influx of electrification, batteries, but it comes from mining, and some of those mining processes still have material risks. So there's that whole element of people wanting better and not realizing what that means in totality. And I just hope we all think of it in a more broader perspective before making a decision or criticizing at least some businesses.
Yeah. I think we definitely have a fair way to go with education, but thanks to people like you, I think we'll get there.
We'll have to.
Yeah. Andrew, thank you so much for being on the show. Really appreciate it. You've definitely taught me a lot about ESG. So thank you so much.
My pleasure. Happy to contribute, and all the best.